Good morning. I'm Dr. John Miller. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Matthew Neal. Dr. Neal is a senior resident and former chief of residence in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Louisville. He completed his undergraduate studies at the University of Kentucky, earning a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering with a minor in mathematics. He earned his medical degree from the University of Louisville School of Medicine. His professional interests include the philosophy of psychiatry, computational neuroscience, and the emerging area of clinical psychedelic research. Today, Dr. Neal will review concepts in complex systems theory, particularly as can be related to the field of psychiatry. He will also look at implications to these concepts in the future. With that, I give you Dr. Matthew Neal.
All right, thank you for that, Dr. Miller. And thank you all for attending virtually. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so may move quick sometimes, but I'll be discussing complexity in psychiatry today. There we go. I don't have any disclosures. Some of the objectives, we want to understand some of the basic properties of complex systems. To do that, we're going to use a system of metaphors. We'll look at some of the history of complexity theory, and then some of the current areas of complexity research in psychiatry and neuroscience, as well as some of the practical limitations of complexity theory. So to preface, over your academic careers, you've probably heard things like this pretty frequently: neglect air pressure or air resistance, ignore friction, assume ideal conditions, use a linear approximation. Complexity theory, or complex systems theory, it deals with everything that you've been asked to neglect or ignore. It's all about the messiness and unpredictability that we struggle to model, or you need to use approximations to describe. It talks about the interaction of many individual parts of the system at one scale and the resultant patterns and properties that emerge on another. Like I said, we're going to be using metaphors here because complexity theory can be heavy on math, and I don't want to subject you to that. It's an interesting field in that it grew from a collaboration of many scientific disciplines, which is rare with the trend of increasing academic specialization. The patterns it describes are ubiquitous in the natural world and very applicable to things that we as psychiatrists care about, including neuroscience, medicine, artificial intelligence, study of psychology, and other social sciences. For us, and why I think this is a particularly important area of inquiry, this promises a deeper understanding of the mind, the brain, and the ways that mental phenomena emerge from brain phenomena. It also offers us a new vocabulary we can use to describe and form hypotheses about psychiatric phenomena, in the same way that Freud used vocabulary extensively from electromagnetism and thermodynamics when he was developing his theory of psychoanalysis. So this is a nice infographic. It just shows sort of what the umbrella of complex systems encompasses in terms of other disciplines. So game theory, collective behavior, nonlinear dynamics, network theory, systems theory, evolution and adaptation, and pattern formation. All of these things inform complex systems theory. And now we'll just take a moment and pose the question, what do these things have in common? We've got a boiling liquid, an ant colony, a brain, a city, a cell, a flock of birds. Well, they are all complex systems. Convection cells and boiling liquid, ant colonies, cities, proteins, cells, flocks of birds, communications infrastructures, power infrastructures, economies, societies, corporations, climate, weather, and of course, the brain. So specifically, what is a complex system? It is a system composed of many components which interact. It's a dynamic network of interactions. And the interesting thing is the behavior of the group when they're all working together may not be predictable according to the behavior of the components. Importantly, a lot of complex systems are also adaptive in that the individual and collective, their behavior mutates and self-organizes depending on perturbations from the environment or the system itself. But big picture, a system where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. That is a complex system. So we're going to go through 5 basic properties so that we have some sort of language we can use to talk about these systems. The first one we'll talk about is emergence. So that is essentially when an entity is observed to have properties its parts do not have on their own. Properties or behaviors which emerge only when the parts interact in a wider whole. We can contrast that with reductionism. Reductionism is something you may have heard the word, may not really know what it's getting on about, but it's something that you have used yourself if you've ever taken a science course. It is implicit in our philosophy of science that we use commonly. Essentially, it's saying you want to understand the system, you take it apart and see what its components do. But the big assertion with reductionism and the problem for us in neuroscience is that it is saying that the whole is equal to the sum of the parts, not greater than, right? Now, emergence, it goes in the opposite direction. It's essentially saying that, yes, well, you may be able to put all of the components of an organism together, all the cells and blood and every other building block. But if they're not organized correctly, they're not coordinated, then you're just going to have a big mess. You're not going to have an organism, right? It's how the parts relate to one another that we find important. So to give some more concrete examples, we can see on the one hand, we've got a component, the individual agent is a water molecule. And when many of these start to interact together, you get the emergent structure of a snowflake. And looking at a molecule of water, if you didn't know that snowflakes existed, it would be really hard to predict that under the right conditions, they would form. So we've got the ants. By themselves, they behave in certain ways and have certain properties, but when they interact and work together, they create these large emergent structures, these colonies that behave in ways and accomplish things that the individual ant can't. Similarly, birds come together to make flocks. Organs come together as organ systems in an organism. And then if we consider the human organism as the individual in the broader system, when they start to interact, all sorts of complex structures come about: cities, societies, cultures, economies, businesses, corporations. And of course, the thing that we're really interested in, the neuron as the individual element, when they interact together, they create this emergent brain and mind. So now let's talk a little bit about self-organization, which is a process where some form of overall order arises from local interactions between parts of an initially disordered system. And that's important. Nothing's telling these components of the system to do this. They do it themselves. The control of the system is distributed to each of its components rather than centralized. And let's take the bird example. A flock of birds is pretty illustrative here. So you can see that there's no bird here, one bird with a megaphone telling all of the other birds how to fly, how to form this flock. What they all do is they're all following a few simple rules. You know, how close or far should I stay at any given time from my nearest neighbor, and which direction are we going? Similarly with a school of fish. They're all following these simple rules, and it creates, when they work together, this greater structure. What you can see here is actually, you can perturb it. You've got the shark punching through the school at one point. It perturbs the system, but it doesn't destroy the system. It's still there. It just deforms and keeps right on going. Again, even more concrete example, we can look at cellular automata. This is Conway's game of life. Some of you may have seen this in your biology classes. It's essentially just a big grid. Each of these squares called cells, they're colored in, they're alive. If they are not, they're considered dead. And each of these squares, at every generation, they follow these 4 rules. So a cell will die if if it only has 2 live neighbors, as if by underpopulation. If it has 2 or 3 live neighbors, it keeps living. More than 3 though, and it dies by overpopulation. And Any dead cell with exactly 3 neighbors that are still alive becomes live by reproduction. So I'm going to keep those schematics down there in the bottom left-hand corner. And you can see that given an initial state for the system, you color in certain grid squares and then let it iterate through the generations, you get these emergent self-organized structures. This is called a glider gun, the gliders being the little objects shooting down diagonally, and the gun being the 2 structures moving back and forth at the top. That glider gun will go on forever, but some of these won't. This is just this beautiful starburst that grows and grows and then eventually just fizzles out. And you can get even more complex behaviors. This is called the R pentamino. And at the initial state, you can see it's 5 colored in squares. But the complexity that arises from this self-organized set of rules is vast. And you can try it for yourself. It's actually pretty fun to play around with. Playgameoflife.com, give it a shot. But if we're talking about self-organization in the brain, we can look at cortical mappings. So this is an example of a study that was done. They mapped the cortical representations of a monkey's digits 1 through 5. So blue to blue, green to green, yellow to yellow, orange to orange, and red to red. And you can see they're arranged in a way that's comparable to how the digits are arranged, adjacent to one another. And of course, any laboratory animal can expect to have something terrible happen to it. This is no exception. They then cut off the monkey's 3rd digit, the middle finger, and 4 weeks later, they check that cortical mapping again. And what they find is, and this is not just for monkeys, this is for humans as well. What they find is that this cortical representation for digit number 3, that yellow blob, has been absorbed by the 2 adjacent cortical representations. The computational resource there of those neurons isn't going to waste. It's being reorganized to benefit the adjacent digits. So now let's talk about scale. We're going to be talking about spatial scale and scales of time. And I think this is a great video that sort of illustrates what I mean when I'm saying scale. Right, starting from these very, very small structures, as we zoom out, we see all of these emergent processes that are occurring on larger and larger scales. And depending on the scale we're looking at, we see very, very different things. So the scale of our measurements dictates in part what we're seeing, and complexity tends to move between many different scales. So to give an example of this, I've got 4 different, academic disciplines listed on the left, and each of them have a specific scale that they're interested in, they study. Obviously, particle physics, the smallest things that we know about, all the way up to the atom itself. Chemistry kind of picks up where particle physics leaves off. It's looking at things that are a little bit larger, leading up into cell biology and physiology. Now, this reminds me of the joke that you hear on academic or undergraduate campuses a lot about chemistry teachers or professors sitting in the cafeteria, sees a biologist walk by and kind of scoffs to himself and says, well, biology, that's just applied chemistry. And a physics professor a couple tables away overhears this and scoffs himself and says, well, chemistry, that's just applied physics. And, academic solipsism aside, there's something to that, right? There's this continuity between these scales and between these disciplines where the rules of particle physics ultimately help us, the rules of chemistry sort of emerge from those. Same relationship with chemistry and cell biology. We've got these small constituent parts come together to make the broader whole. And cell biology, of course, to physiology at a higher scale than that. So in the brain, it is a complex system, but it exhibits nested and hierarchical organization across different scales of time and space. And the patterns of dynamics you see depend on what scale you're looking at. So small scales, you've got the synapse. Many synapses are intrinsic to the neuron. Many come together to interact, creating cortical columns, et cetera, on until we have the full brain. But so those are spatial scales, but let's talk about time scales as well. To understand the importance of what scale of time you're looking at, you can think about heart rate. Up at the top, we have heart rate demonstrated on the order of seconds, right? This is an EKG tracing. If we were to have on the y-axis of this tracing, though, we had just heart rate, and on the x-axis time, it would essentially look like a straight line, maybe a few wobbles in it. And as we zoom out in time, right, we look to the scale of, say, minutes, heart rate over minutes. Doesn't seem nearly as constant. It seems like a much more noisy, variable process. And essentially what we're seeing here is as the resolution changes, we get different information. And so if we look at heart rate on the scale of minutes, that's still not going to show us the full pattern of the dynamic system that is the beating heart. So we can zoom out even further and graph heart rate over hours to days, and we see this sinusoidal pattern emerging. And that's the circadian rhythm that reflects daily waxing and waning of heart rate. So size or time scales, depending on the one you use, it's going to affect what you see, what patterns are available to you. Which brings us to the idea of a fractal, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with that idea. It's a geometric shape containing detailed and self-similar structures at arbitrarily large and small scales. So here's an example of the construction of a Koch snowflake. You're essentially adding smaller versions of the original triangle onto the shape itself over and over and over again, so that no matter how far you zoom in or out, you're still seeing essentially the same shape. Now, why does this matter for us? In biological systems, we're operating on many different scales, right? Cell is a very small scale, and the organism itself, orders of magnitude larger. So how do we effectively move energy or information or nutrients from one scale to the other? And that's when fractals come in. That's also why we see them so much in so many biological systems. If you have, say, a burger, you're going to eat a burger for dinner, and your cells need some of the nutrients from that. But you can't just rub a burger on the cells that are hungry to get them the nutrients. It just doesn't work like that. You have to ingest it, break it down. The nutrients are absorbed into the bloodstream. And then, just like this tree here, starting at the aorta and moving to progressively more small-scale vasculature until you get to the capillary bed, when you can ultimately have that nutrient exchange with the cell on the smaller scale, as well as removal of cellular waste. So these shapes are very important. To illustrate some more of their ubiquity in biological systems, I've got 3 images here. White object on a black background. Take a few seconds, look at them, see if you can figure out what you're looking at here. But you can see all of them qualitatively have this branching structure. And then on the left hand, this is a casting of pulmonary vasculature. The middle, those are just tree branches, inverted color scheme, so I didn't give anything away. And then on the right, we have a neuron that's undergoing arborization. These are all different. They have different functions in different biological systems, but they all share this similar architecture. Let's talk briefly about power law distributions. We're not going to get too much more into math, I promise. It's essentially when one quantity varies as the power of another. So a power law describes an empirical scaling relationship that's an emergent quantitative feature of biodiversity. The features are patterns or structures of dynamics that are self-similar or fractal-like over many orders of magnitude. We're used to seeing and using in biostats, for instance, the random distribution or Gaussian distribution, whose shape is determined by its mean and standard deviation, where most values are going to cluster right around the mean, which is the center. But power laws work differently. You can see on the graph that most of the values cluster to the left side, right? So smaller, in this example, nodes are significantly more common than larger and larger nodes. And interestingly, just like the Gaussian distribution requires the mean to describe it, power law distributions, if you have the scaling exponent below the value of 2, they actually don't have a mean. They'll never converge to a mean value, which means there's no characteristic scale on which those systems need to operate. Again, why they're important for moving things across size scales. Some common examples, just so you get the feel for what these things are talking about. Tree branch diameter, right? For a given tree, branches with small diameters are orders of magnitude more common than those with large. You got one trunk and many twigs. Earthquakes, the most powerful, they're orders of magnitude less common, thankfully, than the smaller, more minor earthquakes. The Richter scale is also logarithmic to reflect this. And then wealth distribution. The poorest individuals, they're orders of magnitude more common than the wealthiest. For our purposes, we do see power law distributions in learning and perceptual systems. Learning is typically thought of as an exponential process. So as you progress, you have this exponential diminishment in your returns. But a lot of those studies are limited. You've only got so much funding to be in a lab for a certain amount of time. But when you look over really long periods at tasks that are allowed, that allow for measurable improvement, learning is described better by a power law. So Crossman in 1959 studied cigar making, and he found that over 7 years, the time it took for a human to make a single cigar continued to improve. Also over 10 million cigars. And it wasn't just the time, it was the quality as well. So it did show like a genuine learning improvement. Tuller et al., they showed this phenomena in the verbal transformation effect. And that's something, even if you haven't heard of it, I promise you're familiar with this concept. You say a word over and over and over and over again, or hear a word over and over again, it starts to sound different. You'll hear every once in a while, maybe a different syllable. So that's the perceptual shift is the verbal transformation effect. And these investigators found that the length of time before that shift in perception also obeys a power law distribution, extending over 4 orders of magnitude. So that's both learning and perceptual systems, which have this marker of complexity. All right, let's move on now to phase transitions. The phase transition is something as a concept that we're familiar with from our chemistry classes, where you have changes in the phase of matter. Essentially, what we're talking about is a change more abstractly between different states of organization in a complex system. So again, to the phases of matter example, this is a diagram that shows when those changes will occur depending on temperature and pressure. But the really crucial point here is these changes, these phase transitions, they happen really, really quickly at all scales of the system. And that's something that's easy for us to take for granted when we're looking at this example, because when you freeze water, you're used to putting it in the freezer and waiting. Well, what you're waiting for is for the average energy of all those molecules to settle down to a certain point. And once it gets to that freezing point, the change happens immediately. It doesn't happen slowly. It's at every scale of the system, you have this transition in organization and behavior. And it's not just for these physical systems, right? It's for all sorts of complex systems. I don't know how loud this will be, so apologies in advance if it's way too loud for anyone. But this is an example of social coordination and phase transitions in social coordination. So that particular example, that was an audience in Austria, I think. But you could tell that initially they were exhibiting this sort of chaotic regime of clapping. Everybody's clapping at their own pace. But then suddenly, and without any prompting from anyone in particular, they shift, they transition almost all at once to clapping in unison. We also see phase transitions in states of consciousness or alertness. So wake to sleep and vice versa represent phase shifts. More rigorous, I suppose you could say, these are phase portraits. You don't have to worry too much about looking at these, but they show essentially the phase shifts and the dynamic behavior of different models of neurons right now. In behavioral systems, we can also see phase transitions. So when subjects are asked to tap their fingers along with a metronome, and they can either tap 2 fingers in phase or out of phase, the metronome then is gradually increased in how quickly it ticks. And what they find is, after a while, the subjects who were asked to be tapping out of phase, right, 180 degrees out of phase, at a certain frequency of the metronome, they shift, they transition abruptly from out of phase tapping to in phase tapping, in part because it's a more stable conformation for the system. We also see this phenomena in speech production and articulation. So again, back to this idea of the verbal transformation effect, you've got a vowel consonant syllable like at. If you say it faster and faster, at, it starts to sound like you're saying ta instead of at, which would be a consonant vowel structure to the syllable. That may seem like a silly example, but it happens for pretty much every vowel consonant syllable. If you repeat it fast enough, it'll switch to consonant vowel. And the investigators here believe that CV syllables might represent something, some more stable state for the verbal system than a VC syllable. And they say that might help explain why the CV syllables appear in every known language, whereas VC syllables don't, and why infants start to babble in CV syllables, ba, ma, and da. So now we can move on here to attractors. Attractors, honestly, they're pretty much what they sound like. It's a set of states towards which a system tends to evolve. And here on the left, you can see this function that is being graphed. This is a chaotic attractor, but the attractors, those are those 2 points you can see that the system seems to be revolving around. And we can't really predict how close or far it's going to orbit those points or when it's going to switch back and forth, but we know that the system tends to hang out around those areas. There are a couple different kinds of attractors, at least a couple that have been described. Chaotic, obviously, the C on the image on the right. But for neurons, we're actually a little more concerned with this idea of the limit cycle attractor. That's image A in the figure there. You can see there's this sort of black circle, right, with 2 arrows, one spiraling in towards it, one spiraling out towards it. For neurons, they have a characteristic firing rate, a basal firing rate. If the neuron's perturbed, whether it's say an excitatory signal, it'll fire faster. But then the outside arrow in the figure A, it shows that the system will then gradually move back. It's attracted back to the limit cycle, the normal firing rate. Same for an inhibitory signal, right? That's the inner arrow that spirals out towards the limit cycle. Whatever perturbation, you eventually get these systems attracted back to these specific states. And if you need a really simple example, I mean, in a physical system, a large gravitational body represents an attractor, and a gravity basin is essentially an attractor basin, right? And you can think of attractors as these hilly landscapes that the balls roll down depending on where they are. In brain systems, the default mode network, the salience network, all of these brain networks that we've begun in recent years to elucidate, these represent attractor states in that they are stable systems or stable states of the system that we can jump back and forth between depending on context or environmental demand. The fact that these, the brain has many different stable states, stable attractors. In that sense, it's called multi-stable. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But that just means that instead of one attractor, there are a lot of different attractors they can jump to as needed. So back to the finger tapping experiments, you can see here we've got representations, these hills on the graph and the balls that roll down into the basin. In the middle, you can see that's 0 phase difference between the two fingers tapping. That's if they're in sync. And then on either side, they're out of phase 180 degrees. So this B over A term, that's the control parameter. It's essentially, in this example, a coupling. How well are the two fingers coupled? And as the system were changed, say, the coupling decreased, you can see that these out of phase attractor basins gradually lose their depth to the point that they're not minima anymore. They're not valleys. They become the tops of the hills. And so you can tell if you put a ball there, it's just going to roll off one way or the other, suggesting that that's not a stable state. And these landscapes of attractors can change all over, depending on the parameter that's adjusted. In some situations, you may have 0 stable attractor states. We can also see attractors in motor systems. So a classic primitive reflex is the stepping reflex in the neonate, which disappears around the 2nd month of life. And that behavior, the stepping behavior, is only seen again once the baby has the cognitive resources, say, to attempt walking. But complexity theory offers a different explanation there, namely that the stepping reflex is some kind of motor module. It's not necessarily something that we are doing consciously, but it does act as an attractor system for for motor behavior. And these investigators found that the control parameters, just like in the previous finger tapping example, that would be coupling, right, between the fingers. Here, the control parameter they found was the ratio of leg strength to leg weight, which determined whether or not the system moved into this stepping motor module. And so what they found was that the strength to weight ratio in a neonate, right, is relatively high. Baby legs are not very strong, but when a baby's just born, the weight is not very high either. So the ratio is high enough for this stepping reflex or this stepping behavior to manifest. Between the months 2 and about 12, strength isn't increasing as much as weight is, and so the ratio drops below some value, and then you don't see the stepping behavior. This primitive reflex, so to speak, disappears, and only then, once the baby started to strengthen its legs more, does the ratio become favorable enough for the stepping behavior to emerge again. Sort of along those lines, this idea of these attractor states, not just in motor systems, but I guess I just want to make the point that these are distributed systems, right? So this is a phenomenon that's been shown in a lot of different mammals, including humans, that after full spinal transection, in this particular study, it was spinal transected cats, they recovered full weight-bearing, standing, and locomotion. And all they did for 5 weeks after the spinal transection was rhythmic manual stimulation of their triceps muscles, and no other intervention. And then they could put them on treadmills, and they found that they would walk and modulate locomotor speed, as well as perform split belt locomotion, meaning one side's moving faster than the other or slower than the other. And again, there's no central input coming from the cat. The spinal cord's been transected. It can't get those signals there. But the motor system, it's programmed into it, right? So these these motor modules, which are super important. Everything that eats and is preyed upon needs to be able to move. So it's not surprising then that we would see a lot of redundancy in how they manifest. All right, so we've covered the big concepts, right, of complex systems, at least for the scope of our discussion here. Let's bring some of them together and try and get the big picture. Complex systems produce emergent properties at larger scales, and that stems from the interaction and self-organization of their components on smaller scales. Complex systems have states of relative stability towards which they're attracted. These phase transitions, through phase transitions, they can move between these stable states and thereby adapt to their environment. Before we go on, it might be worth addressing a point. Why now? Why are we just now getting these theories about complexity described? Why are we only now working on this? So the thing is, not a lot of advances in complexity theory could have happened without computers. These systems produce just too much data and have too many interacting parts for a person armed only with a pencil and paper to really understand. Only when we started to outsource the task of calculation to computers that we've been able to visualize and really understand some of the patterns of the complex systems we're seeing. So let's look at some of the history of complexity. You can trace it back somewhat further, but nobody really was working on this in a meaningful way until the 20th century. And for context, around the turn of the 20th century, you've got Ramon y Cajal's work on the neuron. Freud in 1899 has published Interpretation of Dreams. Special relativity and quantum mechanics are published. World War I and II. Basically, the seeds of a technological revolution are sprouting, and the world's becoming smaller, people more interconnected. And so this gentleman, Erwin Schrödinger, he was, what was the book called? What is Life? He wrote a book called What is Life after some of his foundational work in physics, in which he starts to talk about these different scales of biological systems, right? And obviously he's a physicist, but he had a deep interest in consciousness, mind-body problem, free will. I also think it's interesting that this guy essentially predicted the structure of DNA before Watson and Crick ever discovered it. He postulated this aperiodic crystal. But yeah, one of the first guys in modern times to talk extensively about these systems that extend beyond just one scale of study. Another, Claude Shannon, so the father of information theory. He wasn't necessarily a complex systems theorist per se, but the work that he did in information theory is crucial to any complex system. He's the one who kind of standardized how we track the flow of information in any communication system. So very important for analyzing these systems. Of course, if we need computer resources here, we've got Alan Turing, a huge influence there. Father of artificial intelligence. He was the guy, they now call it the Turing test, made this test to see whether or not you are talking to a machine or to a person. But he also did a lot of work on what is thought, what does it mean to think, and used many examples, again, using vocabulary from other areas, from physical systems to describe how thoughts might work in say, a machine, or how they work in humans. Ilya Prigogine, Russian physical chemist, Nobel laureate. He was one of the first to actually say that he studied complex systems, but a lot of his work was on dissipative structures and irreversibility, chemical systems that are far from thermal equilibrium, which incidentally happens to be where complex phenomena tend to arise if they're going to. And of course, Edward Lorenz, who single-handedly founded chaos theory. He's a meteorologist, coined the term attractor and the butterfly effect, the idea that if a butterfly in Brazil flaps its wings a week later could produce a tornado in Texas. he's also one of the reasons we have relatively accurate weather forecasts out to 10 days now. Just to highlight what an accomplishment and a contribution he made, this is a quote from Kerry Emanuel, who's a meteorologist at MIT, said of Lorenz, that by showing certain deterministic systems of formal predictability limits, he put the last nail in the coffin of the Cartesian universe, fomented what some have called the third scientific revolution of the 20th century, following on the heels of relativity and quantum physics. And that's a pretty big claim, but I honestly don't think it's that much of an exaggeration. This area of study has a lot of promise, and yeah, I think it could yield a lot of impressive results for us. So in 1984, a lot of different scientists got together, many of which were physicists. Some worked on the Manhattan Project, Los Alamos labs. They also had economists, psychologists, members of other fields very disparate from physics. They came together because they all noticed in their work these weird similarities, complex phenomena. So they established the Santa Fe Institute to better study that. And to this day, it's still around. And they endeavor here to understand and unify the shared patterns in all of these different complex systems: physical, biological, social, cultural, technological, and it sounds like they're even doing some work in xenobiology now. They have contributed quite a bit over the years. I'm sure in the future, once this entire framework is more fleshed out, it'll be more commonly talked about. But you know, they've made a lot of efforts in creating artificial life, modeling organisms and ecosystems, foundational contributions in chaos theory, econophysics, network theory. Yeah, a lot of interesting work. So now we'll move on to applications and research in complexity theory. Let's talk about complex systems in psychology. So this is a quote from Van Orton, who wrote this really good book chapter about complex systems in psychology. He says, living systems are attracted to optimal temporary states of flexible coordination, and best guarantees contextually appropriate behavior and well-being of the actor. He also points out from MEG, EEG, and behavioral data in the finger tapping experiments that the transitions that they saw, what really blew them away was the idea that brain and behavior are reorganizing themselves at the same time together, and way too close in time to allow conscious information processing. Complexity comes up in empirical variance, and we know statistics is a really important aspect of studying psychological phenomena. Typically, we say there are two types of variance: the explainable and the random, which is the measurement error. Though complexity shows there's a third type. They call it pink noise, but you know, different investigators call it different things. Again, this is the type that has no mean value. The longer and longer you get data sets, right, typically we expect that it's going to show us more and more, progressively more reliable mean value. But for systems that demonstrate this pink noise, there is no mean value. It never settles down. And the more data you collect, the more you're going to get these rare but extreme values that push the mean further and further. And we contrast pink noise with the idea of white noise, which is overly random, or brown noise, overly ordered. And you can actually see that the scaling exponent here sort of dictates what pattern of noise you're getting. Again, pink noise is in that sweet spot with the power or the exponent of less than 2. Essentially, what these qualities are suggesting about a system, white or brown noise in the data collected from a system correspond to suboptimal coordination of its components, whereas pink corresponds to optimal or adaptive coordination. And you actually see this coming up in pathology. You see it in advanced aging, where posture and gait move from a more optimal adaptive regime to an overly random, whereas heart rate, body temperature, and resting neural activity move from pink, which is optimal and adaptive, to overly rigid or inflexible. And I think it's really interesting that you can see these phenomena occurring in Huntington's disease and Parkinson's disease. Huntington's is obviously we're moving from pink to a more random sort of regime. We've got the choreoathetoid movements of Huntington's patients, the ballism that they exhibit sometimes, but really, really cool. The degree of departure from pink noise to white reliably predicts the severity of other symptoms. So this is in some ways a quantitative biological measure of disease severity. Similarly with Parkinson's, gait, arm movements, and speech all move from pink to brown noise, right? Adaptive to overly rigid and inflexible. And similarly, the degree of departure reliably predicts severity of other symptoms. And there is actually a really interesting model, a complexity model of the progression of Parkinson's disease, where you see in early disease, you've got a spectral plot that shifts towards brown noise, and it starts doing that at the really small, short, or fast time scales, right? And those are the first sort of symptoms that you get, the mild tremors, small deficits in gait, the vocal tremor. And then as the disease progresses, progressively you get compromise at longer and longer time scales, right? So until ultimately at the end of the disease course, you have frozen movement altogether. Now let's talk about complexity in computational neuroscience. Computational neuroscience is essentially a way to make mathematical models of brain function and figure out how does the nervous system process information. We can use these models to help us see trends in network behavior under various conditions, see different brain dynamics, normal functioning, and in physiology, or excuse me, in pathology. And there are a couple different models that they use. Neural mass models, probably the most well described. It assumes a strong coherence between individual neurons. It also assumes that the ensemble activity, so the cluster of neurons that they're modeling, is sufficiently close to the mean activity that the variance can be discarded. It has a few subtypes. One assumes that coherence is so strong that the ensemble actually resembles the dynamic of a single neuron. A lot of the single neuron models use conductance models, like the Hodgkin-Huxley model, actually, and they'll just apply that model directly to the neural mass model. Others, they use empirical data to help build the model up, understanding the response of the system to its inputs, and that's actually the method that Hodgkin and Huxley used to derive their squid axon model initially. So here you can see a schematic representation of the creation of a neural mass model. And on the far left, you have what would be essentially a collection of neurons taken from tissue. We abstract that, idealize it a bit, and ultimately you wind up with these collective clusters of excitatory and inhibitory neurons interacting together. These models often incorporate a function that maps firing rate, the average firing rate of that neural mass, to its average membrane potential. And when they run these models, they see here on the far right, at the bottom, this the red swooping shape, that is the phase portrait of a neural mass model. So at the bottom is a fixed point attractor, and this big sweeping oval shape, that's a limit cycle attractor. So it's multi-stable, moves back and forth between this fixed point and the cycle. But again, the neural mass model is only a representative of a small patch of cortex. How do we model bigger, larger brain phenomena? And that's where brain network models come in, which are also called networks of neural mass models, ensembles of ensembles, so to speak. So essentially what they're doing is just taking a bunch of little neural masses and stringing them together in a way that's informed by the connectome. And what they get ultimately, you've got this description of the cortex as a discrete network of dynamic nodes coupled through the connectome. The next example I'm going to show is a field model which uses wave equations. I do think it's interesting that whole wave particle duality is where we see it in models everywhere, not just in physics, but here in how we model the brain. And so the neural field model is another very popular model for large-scale brain activity. They assume that the cortex is a continuous sheet, dense short-range connections that are going to exponentially diminish in number with interareal distance. And they describe the local connectivity by a wave equation. This model in particular that we're seeing on the right, this is a neural field model that also includes a neural mass in the thalamus. And that's when they say these models can incorporate corticothalamic loops and patchy connectivity, that's part of what they mean. And they found that when they put a neural mass in the thalamus, along with this neural field model, they got EEG data from their model that was strikingly similar in spectral characteristics to that they got empirically from resting EEG. So they actually got an alpha rhythm from their models, which is really cool. So again, we're going to touch on this idea of multi-stability. Here you can see this on the outside of these little rings, or of this ring here. This is the limit cycle. In the middle, in the basin, is the fixed point attractor. And you can see you've got here the average behavior of the system on the far left. That's what it does when it hobbles around in the middle. In the middle image, you've got the average behavior when it's the limit cycle attractor. But importantly, if there's no noise in this system, then they typically don't switch back and forth. But when you inject a bit of noise into these multi-stable attractor systems, you get this function that's jumping back and forth then as it evolves between one attractor state and another. And this is really cool because it actually shows, we've got at the top empirical data from resting EEG, which shows on the far right this bimodal, this multi-stable distribution. You see the black curve and then the red curve, the two stable states, and the neural field model with the corticothalamic loop. Again, you've got the same degree of multi-stability and very similar spectral characteristics. We can see neural field models applied in epilepsy, and this is really cool. You've got figure A. This is scalp EEG data of an absence seizure, and the spectrum of it below. On the far right, you can see the phase portrait for the absence seizure. There's a limit cycle attractor and a fixed point attractor. And then again, with the corticothalamic neural field model, when you perturb it with 3 Hertz bifurcation, you get something that looks really, really similar to the spectral characteristics of the absence seizure in this patient. The phase portrait, similarly, it's cleaner, but you still have the two really important features here, this fixed point attractor or resting state, and then the limit cycle attractor that represent the seizure itself. So we see computational neuroscience being used now in other areas, and in areas of psychiatry as well. So Breakspear, for instance, he did a study on cognitive and emotional processing in individuals at genetic risk for bipolar disorder. Essentially, he took a group of first-degree relatives of patients with bipolar. So there's the genetic risk, 45 matched healthy controls, 55 participants with established disorder. And he found that the connections, so the network connections in the brain actually differ between each of those patient groups. So healthy controls did not have the same network features that the at-risk patients had, but the at-risk folks they had some of the characteristics of the network connectivity of bipolar patients, but just enough compensation in other areas, you could say, to keep them from progressing to that point. We've seen computational neuroscience used in schizophrenia. So they showed Wagner et al. Functional and structural disconnectivity in the fronto-thalamic system in schizophrenia. And this was a really interesting finding from their study. They found this disconnectivity was actually seemed to be a right lateralized process in schizophrenic patients, which is pretty interesting. It didn't have a good way to fully explain why that might be. But yeah, they found that there was significantly lower activation in the Stroop task relative to healthy controls in a predominantly right lateralized fronto-thalamocerebellar network. So pretty cool here. And of course, they're using dynamic causal modeling to help build their models. There's also a study here in computational neuroscience and melancholic depression. So they collected, again, 3 groups of individuals, healthy matched controls, patients with melancholic depression, and patients with depression who did not have melancholia. And what they found was really distinct differences, obviously, in the connectivity and function of the healthy controls versus both depressed and melancholic depressed patients. They also found significant differences between both sets of depressed patients, right? So the melancholic patients had a different sort of dysfunction than the non-melancholic patients, which is really cool because it's essentially showing more evidence, but more objective, quote unquote, evidence that these 2 different types of depression are actually 2 different disease processes. So let's move on now and talk a little bit about the implications for psychiatry. Broadly speaking, many of the successes of modern medicine, we can attribute those to our understanding of how any organ produces or fails to produce functions that are important to our lives. We don't have that for the brain yet. Reductionism hasn't really delivered for neuroscience in the way that it has for other areas of medicine. And this has big implications for the medical neuroscience, especially psychiatry, in large part because our field straddles this conceptual divide between the mind and the brain, this mind-brain problem, Cartesian dualism. So the current state of our field now, our treatments arise from theory or serendipity rather than disease mechanism. And so there haven't been as many innovations in psychiatric treatment compared to the rest of medicine. We also measure our disease courses and treatment efficacy in terms of qualitative, subjective means because we don't have objective biomarkers. And of course, our diagnoses are syndromic. The criteria are based on the observable, relatively superficial commonalities among subgroups of the mentally ill. And so by extension, of course, there's no way for us now to rigorously establish what symptoms represent normal variants in humans and what actually represents a pathological process. Some of you may have seen around the time of the publication of DSM-5, a few books came out. One of them was called Saving Normal, talking about how DSM-5 may over-pathologize things. We don't have a good concrete way to determine what's pathology and what isn't yet. So right now, complexity theory represents one of our best hopes for understanding how brain phenomena produce mental and behavioral phenomena. It takes all of the messiness and all the moving parts into account. And should the application of complexity theory allow us to make headway on the mind-brain problem? If it actually allowed us to cast off this legacy of Cartesian dualism, then yeah, the field of psychiatry, we can expect it to be transformed. Our diagnoses could be based on mechanism, illness established, tracked by biomarkers or objective measures, treatment similarly informed by mechanism, which will provide a solid foundation for theory and for novel treatments, some of which we may not have even imagined yet, but also in the neuromodulatory world. So TMS will, I think, become much more prominent as we better clarify how the brain is functioning on large scales and producing the phenomena we care about. We'll be able to tell the difference between normal variants and true pathology, and potentially begin to pinpoint necessary and sufficient conditions that lead to illness, whatever form they might take, and then provide more targeted and efficacious interventions. This is a quote from C. Hooker, who is a philosopher of science. There we go. And of complex systems, he says that although there are plenty of fragments of a mature framework in terms of limitations of complexity theory, it's right now still kind of impossible to present a finished product. The field's just too immature. At this stage, much of the substance of what we know about complexity lies more or less implicit in domain-specific detail. Again, all of these different academic disciplines that have described different facets of complexity, their models are where that implicit information is. Yeah, complexity theory is really young. It's a very broad area, and there's so much we don't know about it. We don't have a philosophy of science for it. We don't know necessary and sufficient conditions to define what is complexity and what is not. We don't have any formalisms that effectively or efficiently describe the relational and interactive nature of these systems. You know, we can model using a harmonic equation. We can model a pendulum. We can also model cellular respiration. But a harmonic equation does not tell you anything about how those systems, how their constituents are organized and how they relate to one another. It's all one very idealized formative behavior. And if you want a really good example of a practical issue we run into with complexity theory, I mean, these systems are gigantic, just innumerable interactions. This concept of logical depth is pretty instructive in how hard these can be to deal with. So imagine that you've got, well, first of all, on the right, this is a truth table. It's used in formal logic and logic circuits and control systems, essentially to check premises, to show you what values certain premises can take when they are separate and together, and can show you some argument or some circuit output is going to be consistent. So this particular truth table on the right, it's got two variables. That leads to 2 to the 4 rows in that truth table. So you can check it. You can check the truth table, see if it's consistent, and great. But these complex systems are so big that, I mean, say you had a supercomputer that checked one line of a truth table every 3 × 10⁻23 seconds. And that is the time it takes light to traverse the diameter of a proton. So insanely fast, insanely fast. It would still take longer than the age of the universe to check an argument containing just 137 premises. That's wild. I mean, the respective truth table then would have 2 to the 137th lines, greater than 10 to the 41st to be checked. And these systems, they get so big and explode so quickly, it's really hard to describe them. So we're getting close to the end here, so I'll say a few closing remarks. I do think it's a beautiful irony that complexity theory has arisen from the interactions of so many different academic disciplines over timescales, big and small. And aside from the many insights that this revolution of thought's starting to provide us, I think the theory's tendency towards this interdisciplinary inquiry and its focus on unifying principles, I think it complements psychiatry really well. Psychiatry, like complexity theory, it's a discipline informed by myriad sciences, hard and soft. It's a field of synthesis, self-knowledge, and integration. We're integrating data from many different disparate sources, and our overarching goal here is to deepen the understanding of the human condition and help relieve some of the suffering inherent to our existence. I think complexity theory offers a robust new way to accomplish those goals. And I do anticipate that it will go on to have a profound and enduring impact on psychiatry as the field of complexity grows and evolves. So if you found this stuff pretty interesting and want to see a little bit more how complexity theory is applied to neuroscience, Dynamic Patterns is a great book. It's pretty accessible, not too much math. This J.A. Scott Kelso gentleman, he's the finger tapping investigator. If you want a bit of a broader view of complexity, you can check out the Philosophy of Complex Systems by Cliff Hucker. It's not just a philosophy book. It's actually, I think it's got a chapter devoted to a separate discipline. I can't remember how many there are, but they talk about anthropology and complex systems, ecology, biology, engineering, medicine, psychology, and of course they do have a philosophy section as well. But I'm pretty sure this book has a free PDF copy floating around online. Just throw that out there. And then if you aren't afraid of the maths, because this book is basically just maths, Dynamical Systems in Neuroscience is a great overview of our current mathematical models of neurons. If all of that sounds fair and fine, but you definitely don't want to, go look into something so in depth and intense, just want to check out more about complexity. These are some really good books that are written for a lay audience. That they all treat different elements of complexity theory in a really accessible way. And I think most of them have audiobooks, so worth checking out. All right. So before we go forward, I do just want to say some thank yous. I would like to thank my fellow residents for their camaraderie over the past 4 years. I'd like to thank the department for the opportunity of training here. Dr. Casey, our chair, and Dr. Caudell, our program director, as well as my supervisors over the years, Dr. Ruth L. Malik, Dr. Ben Shanebuckler, and Dr. Gary Weinstein. And of course, a huge thank you to our program coordinator, Christy, who's done so much for the residents in the department. I would also like to give a special thanks to Dr. John Miller for his generosity, his wisdom, mentorship, and invaluable support. And last, but certainly not least, a special thanks to the Fancy Monkeys, whose friendship has been enriching beyond words. And with that said, let's move on to questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Matt. That was very, very interesting. It's certainly something we don't really talk much about. What got you interested initially in complex systems?
Yeah, well, I mean, I did electrical engineering in undergrad, so I kind of had some exposure to subject matter a little bit different from medicine, as well as exposure to medicine. And I think it was the commonalities that these qualities of these systems that you're seeing in so many different fields, the patterns, I don't know, they just they itch at your brain. What is this? What's going on? And yeah, over the years, just kind of as I looked deeper and deeper into it, this idea of complexity theory, yeah, I sort of just landed on it. So it was a pretty circuitous route.
Matt, I just wanted to say you took an incredible amount of information, made it cogent and concise in your interpretation of it, and made it applicable to our field. Of course, I've got the brain itch as well. I just wanted to say thank you for such a great talk.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. Yeah, it is a lot. It's a lot of information. And I mean, the stuff that we talked about too, it's a very condensed version. You can get a lot more in depth with all of these things.
A good bit of scholarship appreciated.
Thank you, Dr. Lippman.
We're a little bit low on that sometime, but you did a great job at that.
Appreciate it. Oh, okay, here we go. Are we any closer? We've got a question from Dr. Brian Casey. Are we any closer to having a functional definition of what a thought is? That's a great question. Any closer than, compared to when? I would say yes, we are closer. I think even back in, gosh, when was it? I can't remember when this book was published. There's a book, Godel, Escher, and Bach. It was written by a computer. I think he does work in artificial intelligence in Ohio. But it won the Pulitzer Prize. It's a really good book. But even then, he's talking about some of these models of brain behavior and what we would need to look for what a thought actually counts as. And I'm sure at some point we're going to have to make some kind of distinction if we're defining what these qualitative aspects of our experience are. You know, some people, everybody's going to have a different idea what a thought might be. And I do know that a lot of different investigators have put out different theories about how we might classify those. Are there any, or are there other psychiatrist authors or scholars in this area? Yes, I know there are, because I found some of their work. It's not as common to see a psychiatrist actually doing some of these complex systems studies, in part because a lot of them, I mean, the computational neuroscience is really in depth. There's a lot of math to it. It's kind of out of our wheelhouse. We see these patterns. We see them in our patients and in their thoughts and emotions. We see it in society. So they're certainly salient to us. But psychiatrists specifically, I can't, no names are coming to mind, but I can say at the very least, I found a PhD thesis for a clinical psychologist that applied complex systems to bipolar disorder, that's a pretty interesting read.
Would you be able to give us some of the highlights of what that author argued?
I can send the thesis out. It's been a while since I read that one. It was back in I think in 1991 when he wrote it. But it was a case study of a bipolar patient, and it was pretty heavily informed by complexity theory and how he chose to describe the presentation of the case and the progression of the symptoms. I mean, in a sense, your bipolar mania you could consider it as a different state, a different attractor system, right? That you have either a gradual or abrupt phase transitions into in states of pathology. I know that was a piece that came up a fair amount. The idea of entropy and chaos in a system definitely came up as well. Yeah, it's, in terms of specific details, I don't think there are a ton just from the case study, but it's more of an overview of, I guess, complexity as it could be applied to bipolar disorder. Let's see, got another question here. From Dr. Stewart. I think about rigidity versus chaos in Dan Siegel's work, and how this relates to pink noise as a metaphor for optimal brain function. Yeah, there was actually, I mean, in the interest of trying to keep this super broad topic within the time limit, I had to cut a fair amount of the discussion about pink noise and how different investigators are using this statistical phenomenon to describe different systems. But it's pretty interesting. It does come up in a lot of different biological systems. It comes up in repeated tasks of learning. One example that was given, participants in a study asked to estimate how much, when a short time had passed, like 3 seconds maybe a bit more. And the more they did it, the more they practiced it, the distribution of their responses went from white noise, overly random, more to pink noise, which means they're starting to reorganize whatever learning and perceptual system as they practice to a more optimal estimate of the task. And that is one thing that is just so cool about these things, this modularity. it allows for a ton of flexibility when all these components are coordinated in the right ways. So very adaptive for an organism. Any other questions, comments, anything that I can try and clarify?
There's one more question. I'll read it out. Question on how this approach may change or augment psychiatric diagnoses. For example, the development of the DSM-6.
Sure. And that's a big hope of mine, is that especially with these studies in computational neuroscience, where we're creating brain models, right? We're creating a mechanistic model of how the brain might be working, and then we can compare what the model shows us to what our empirical data shows us. And you can do that for a ton of different phenomena, right? It's being done in studies of depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, like those three I mentioned earlier, and particularly the melancholia study, right? That was pretty good evidence that there's a separate process occurring in melancholic depression than in non-melancholic depression. So already we're starting to delineate on a more objective, concrete level the differences between these disease processes and then how they manifest. And that's, at least to begin with, that's what I see for psychiatry moving forward, the benefits of that. It's going to give us an ability to actually test some of our theories in a way that's a lot more rigorous. And then we can start to determine which of these pathologies are actually different entities, or if they're pathologies at all.
Great talk, Dr. Neal. So humans are a complex system. That's obvious. But when you think about complex systems, you start thinking about the individual parts that make up that system. And a lot of the studies that are done today are trying to look at specific abnormalities in brain structure and the way that electricity flows through the brain and whatnot, which you described. With these studies, when you're thinking about development of new treatments, you kind of start to ignore the complexities of the humans and everything put together. With these new studies, how long until we have a new age where we try brain ablations again in psychiatric patients, and how long after that will we start to regret it?
Probably not too long. I don't know. The pendulum always swings. We'll always come back around to old treatments, I think, and later come to regret them again as our understanding changes. But yeah, I think moving forward, once we've got a better handle on, because I really do believe that this mind-brain problem, right, this Cartesian dualism, it is a fundamental issue that our field faces every day. We're approaching care for our patients from two different directions, one from a more reductionistic neuroscience point of view, and one from a more top-down, qualitative, behavioral, phenomenological point of view. And those things meet somewhere in the middle, right? But I think once we've got a better handle on that, and that's not as much of a focus on our field's efforts anymore, we can start seeing how all of these different things, big and small, come together to produce pathology, like the patient who's depressed for completely legitimate reasons because they live in a place where they have to have 3 jobs just to support their family and no time for themselves, and they're exhausted and overwhelmed. And if we have a way to actually quantify the influence of that on the patient's mental health, then I think we can more safely say the obvious things we already know, that this is problematic. This degree of poverty is problematic for this patient and it's causing distress. Now, what we do about that, it's hard to say, but I think having a framework that allows us to pinpoint where the influences on mental illness are coming from is something that will be very powerful moving forward if we ideally get to that point.
Thank you very much. I think that's a great answer. I'm wondering, we can do as much as we can as psychiatrists studying the actual medical aspect of mental illness, but the societal aspects of mental illness are very strong, and we don't have as much foot in the game with that, which maybe we should. But thank you very much.
Sure. And I think I was actually having a discussion, I think it was with Dr. Casey the other weekend. I think recently psychiatry has gotten, at least in the popular media, much more attention in recent years. Almost the same amount of attention that cardiology was getting 20, 30 years ago. The problem is, cardiologists can measure, objectively measure pathologies and how certain societal influences like fast food or not getting enough exercise, how those are impacting cardiac health. We do the same sorts of things, but we use these metrics that are less reliable. There's a lot more variation when it's a subjective or self-reported piece of data. And so having something that will give us a little bit more objectivity, I think at the very least will help us advocate and argue for our patients' well-being more effectively.
Thanks for your presentation, Dr. Neal. I think we'll wrap it up and you guys have a nice day.
All right. Thanks everyone for your attention.